right, welcome everybody. My name is Riley, and today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making my version of a presidential tier list. Before we actually get started, and before I kind of dive into what I'm going to be doing on this presidential tier list, I'm a professor of history, and teaching in the classroom is great and all, but I thought with a YouTube channel I would like to reach out to more people and kind of teach them more about history. And so that's largely why I'm ultimately going to be making this video, and hopefully many others. I kind of wanted to dabble a little bit into it, just to kind of help expand history and help inform some people, especially on misconceptions throughout history. Now, I follow myself a lot of YouTube channels that post a lot of history content. And one thing I see that's extremely popular is these presidential tier list. And I thought, so what better topic to start your channel with than to go into your own presidential tier list. And so hopefully from here, this is a good experience. Hopefully you guys learn a lot from this. Hopefully it's quite a bit different from the other presidential tier lists that you've probably saw, and maybe I put in some different input, but hopefully overall you'll enjoy. All right, so before we get started with my version of the presidential tier list, let's kind of start off with kind of a basis of what this is going to look like. So in order, I'm going to rank every president from the first president of the United States all the way down to, not the most current, but we're going to make it all the way up to LBJ, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But anyways, I'm going to be ranking them and putting them into one of these, let's see, how many categories is this? 7 categories. Now, I wanted to kind of go through the categories and what each one means before we get started. Now, the first category is the S category. This is essentially the best of the best. And beforehand, I haven't made any rankings, essentially putting them in any particular order. All this is being freehand and done for the first time as I'm making this video. But I only envision seeing 2 people being put in this S category. However, I may convince myself a little bit later on. But these are essentially the best of the best presidents. Underneath that, I have the A category, which, as you could probably guess, these are very exceptional presidents. However, they didn't have necessarily the qualities to be an S president. And then you have the B, which is above average. They were good presidents during their lifetimes. However, there were some negative aspects. You have the C, which is going to be essentially our baseline, where we'll probably see a lot of the presidents eventually fall under. This is essentially your average president. They had some good, they had some bad. Then you have the D's. This is where the bad starts to weigh out the good, and they weren't overly good presidents. And then you have the F category, which, as you could probably guess, get a failing grade. These are the worst of the worst presidents. I'm going to try to limit the number of presidents I put in this particular category, but this one will probably be a little bit bigger than what we'd see, say, with the S category. Now, with all those in place, I do want to recognize the final category, which I've labeled as incomplete. Now, with the incomplete category, there are some presidents in U.S. history that just did not serve that long in the presidential office because they ended up dying in the office. We'll talk about them a little bit later on when we get to them, but I'm going to put them in the incomplete category because there's just not a lot of information surrounding them. All right, so with that kind of outline, hopefully you understand some of the criteria for these presidents. I'm going to be looking at all aspects of their presidency based around their leadership skills, based around legislation that was passed during their administration, as well as policies that they supported or didn't support. So we'll take all of that into consideration. One thing I won't consider is basically, how should I put it? I won't consider any prior experience or experience after the presidency when talking about each one of these individuals. Let's go ahead and start off the presidential tier list. And what better president to start it off with than our first president of the U.S., that of George Washington. Now, he's an easy S for me. And the reason for this, and I'm not going to go too in detail into a lot of his policies, but it's largely because he really establishes the president of the United States. When he takes the presidential office, the thing to remember is that the U.S. is just beginning the government under the U.S. Constitution. This had never been done before in world history, and therefore Washington was largely tasked with trying to make sure that this new government would run effectively. And 2, what also is going to give him the S category is that he does help solidify the United States, keep it out of European wars, but also is he steps down from power. He had done this during the American Revolution, and he saw that after 2 presidential terms that his time as president had come to an end, and he had willingly stepped down from power. And this sets a precedent, as we see even to this day. It's now actual law to where a president can only serve 2 presidential terms. And we'll ultimately see several presidents moving forward that are elected to 2 terms won't seek out a 3rd term following Washington's precedent. All right, with that said, following his administration, we then go into the Adams administration. And largely, Adams tries to continue what Washington had done during his administration. He tries to continue keeping the United States out of war. However, we do see he does get involved in a quasi-war with France. However, in trying to keep the United States out of war, he's ultimately going to limit rights of Americans to ensure that, especially a radical French rhetoric that was developing during the French Revolution, wouldn't begin to influence the American public, and thus he passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, which heavily limit the rights of Americans, especially that First Amendment right, the right to free speech. And so with that said, he becomes extremely unpopular following this, especially amongst the rival political faction, that of the Democratic Republicans, and it ultimately leads to his demise in the presidential office. And I think with that in mind, while it is a positive that he keeps the U.S. out of war, especially during this formative period, because wars are very costly and the U.S. was just beginning to pay off its American Revolutionary War debt, I think that is a positive. However, the Alien Sedition Acts extremely limit the rights of Americans. And so with that in mind, I believe he falls easily into the D category. Moving on from there, he's going to be defeated in the election of 1800, which would become the first contested presidential election in U.S. history. But nonetheless, we're going to see the rise of another founding father, that of Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, he's a very contradictory figure, especially in his views centering around that notion of all men are created equal. We see that he will condemn during his life the institution of slavery. However, he continues to practice it and actually doesn't free many of his slaves himself. You're probably very familiar with the story of Sally Hemings. However, with all that considered, let's just focus on his administration. So what did he accomplish that was good during his administration is he continues along Washington and Adams' approach of keeping the United States out of war. Keeps them out of the developing Napoleonic Wars, which both sides were hoping the U.S. would at some point become involved in. We also see during his administration that he limits wars, especially in regards to the Barbary pirates. However, the greatest accomplishment of his administration would be that of the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the United States. Now, this extends the national government, something he didn't want to do, but nonetheless, this is going to make him widely popular, and it will help later lead to the foundations of many of the modern states we see today, obviously Louisiana, but many of those states that make up much of the Midwest. See, that ultimately leads to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, people are probably thinking, well, maybe he's an S president. Well, there's one major black mark on his presidency, and that's the Embargo Act of 1807, which essentially cuts off American trade with the rest of the world. And what we'll actually see is that he's going to use the U.S. Navy as well as the U.S. Army to enforce this, to make sure that the Americans don't trade with anybody else. And so with that said, for me, it brings him down to that of a B rank. Moving on, we're moving to James Madison. James Madison, he's another Democratic Republican like Thomas Jefferson. And what we ultimately see is he's trying to continue the legacy of Jefferson and ultimately try to, well, at this point, they're trying to kind of expand the national government, but at the same time keep it more limited than what we would see with the Federalist. However, he does get us involved in the War of 1812. In reality, where he could actually have sought out some sort of compromise with Great Britain, because what we did see is on June 16th, the British Parliament issues a conciliatory proclamation in the United States to keep them out of war between the two nations. But nonetheless, he gets involved in the War of 1812. We ultimately see under his watch, the U.S. Capitol is going to be fired and burned, which includes the White House. So it's definitely not a good mark on your record. But nonetheless, he will lead the United States out of what would become known as the Second War for Independence. He'll go on to serve a second term. But nonetheless, there wasn't really a whole lot remarkable with his administration, and he wasn't really an overly effective commander-in-chief. We also see that he allows the Charter of the United States Bank to expire, especially in the days right before the War of 1812. And so, with all this considered, I'd probably put him as a D. Just not overly effective. Um, there was some good. I guess you can make the argument he's not quite enough, but I think he's definitely a D president. But I'd rank him uh, on an actual list where you rank every president 1 through 46. I'd rank him higher than John Adams. With that said, then we move into the Monroe administration. Monroe had served as Madison's Secretary of State. However, like Madison, not a whole lot's going to occur during his administration. We do see the inauguration of what's known as the era of good feelings. However, this quickly comes to an end during his administration. Following America's, I guess you could say, victory during the War of 1812, it's more of a draw. But anyways, what we see is that America is essentially seeing this period of prosperity because there was only one ruling political party, that of the Democratic Republicans. And so Monroe is going to oversee much of this period. We do see prosperity within the American economy. However, it abruptly comes to an end with the Panic of 1819, as well as with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, essentially where we see slavery becomes the predominant issue in the national government. And as you could probably guess, it's one of those stepping stones that eventually leads us on the road to civil war. What is then going to be followed by is an era of bad feelings. However, we do see one major accomplishment Monroe does push through his administration. It's going to be in regards to the Monroe Doctrine. And essentially, he's going to try to stomp European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. What he's going to declare through that Monroe Doctrine is that if these nations do entrend on the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. would see this as an act of war, and therefore the U.S. would therefore declare war. As you can probably guess, seeing events that will occur in the future, this will be very influential in future U.S. Diplomatic politics. But with all that considered, I think he's an easy C for me. I think he's just there wasn't a whole lot of remarkable aspects to his respective administration. All right, moving on from him, we're going to then move into John Quincy Adams. Now, Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State of James Monroe. He had helped draft the Monroe Doctrine. However, we're ultimately going to see that much of his administration is going to be shrouded in controversy, largely because we had seen during the election of 1824 that almost a corrupt bargain had been struck between him as well as the Speaker of House, Henry Clay, to essentially give Quincy Adams the election. It had become a contested election. We saw that there was no presidential candidate who had carried a majority of the electoral votes, so it went to the Congress. And despite leading the electoral votes, that being Andrew Jackson, Quincy Adams eventually wins out because he promises Henry Clay the Secretary of State position within his cabinet. The reason that's very influential is because largely it was seen at the time that the Secretary of State position led to you becoming president. However, this would not be the case. But anyways, it's going to be shrouded in controversy. We'll ultimately see that John Quincy Adams, despite being a skilled diplomat and politician, his presidency is going to be very lackluster. We'll see eventually he'll release the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. But nonetheless, what we see is his administration is going to be very unremarkable. I'm just going to have to put him in the C category because, like I said, there's just not a whole lot with this administration to really work with. I think you could make a strong argument for a D, but I'm going to go ahead and put him in the C because I think if he had not been undermined by Jackson and the new developing Democratic Party, I think ultimately he might have been much more successful as president. All right. With that said, ultimately, the man that Adams had defeated in 1824 would come back to haunt him and win the election of 1828 and become the 7th president, and that is Andrew Jackson. He's really the first common man to come to the presidency, and what we do see is he does extend the rights for the common man. He essentially extends the right to vote, I shouldn't say he himself, but he does promote the idea that the right to vote should be given to all eligible white male voters. That's one thing I want to be especially clear about. Before this, what we'd seen is that in many states, and it was starting to die out by this point, though, is they believe that only white landowners should be the ones that should have the right to vote. However, Jackson very much believes the idea that all of the common American citizenry, which is white males, should be allowed the right to vote. We also see that he displays strong leadership during the nullification crisis of 1832, where he stands up against the South Carolinians, who were very much supporting the notion of secession. However, ultimately, by showing force, Jackson convinces them to step down. So that was a positive on his administration. However, there are a lot of negatives with this, and he's very much a controversial president. We see that he does not renew the charter for the Bank of the United States, effectively destroying it, something that would not be in place until 1913 during the Wilson administration, which would lead to a very unstable U.S. economics system. However, more notably, what we do see during his administration, though, is that he enacts Indian removal policies that eventually lead to the Trail of Tears that occurs during his successor's administration, that of Martin Van Buren. And one thing I forgot to mention that's a positive, though, we do see during his administration that the United States becomes debt-free. However, nonetheless, it doesn't stop the growing economic crisis centered around the loss of the Bank of the United States. But anyways, with all that considered, I'm going to have to put him as a C. I think there's good with his administration. However, there's also a lot of bad. I think you could even make the argument with the D, because he does inaugurate this idea of the spoil system, to where he could essentially appoint anyone he wanted to into these lesser government positions within his administration. All right. So from Jackson, we're now going to move into a lot of mediocre presidents. Essentially, up till we get to the time of Lincoln, many of these presidents are going to be unremarkable, and in many cases are going to be extremely bad presidents. But nonetheless, we're going to review them in their respective administrations. Jackson's successor is going to be his handpicked successor, that of Martin Van Buren, who's a Democrat. He'll take the he'll take the White House in 1837. Quickly, he's going to be faced with a panic to where the U.S. will see a large depression in 1837, and as a result, he's going to become known as Martin Van Ruin. His administration is going to be relatively unremarkable outside of this. However, he does, I think it's during his administration, towards the latter end of it, he does try to back legislation to support potentially a renewal of the National Bank. Maybe it was a little bit afterwards. I can't quite remember. But nonetheless, we see that his administration is quite unremarkable. However, with the association and not really helping the United States during the panic of 1837, I think that puts him clearly in the D category. All right, next up we have being the next president, because Martin Van Buren will eventually be defeated in the election of 1840. We'll see a new president who was very much like Jackson, an old war hero, especially the War of 1812, who would rise to the presidency, would be William Henry Harrison. Now, I'm going to put him in the incomplete category because he's only going to serve 30 days in office. Being 62 years old, which at the time was extremely old. I mean, today we see that as almost a norm, but back then, to live to 62, you lived a very long life. But anyways, being of a very old age, when he delivers his inaugural address, it's going to be an extremely cold and ugly weather. As a result, we're going to see he's going to deliver the longest inaugural address in presidential history, that of 2.5 hours. However, he'll ultimately serve the shortest term in office because quickly he's going to develop a cold, which would then turn into pneumonia. Within a month of his administration, he's going to die in office. As you probably guessed, being bedridden much of the time, he's not going to do a whole lot that's going to impact the country. So he's going to be in the incomplete category. So then we're going to turn to his successor, that of John Tyler, who's going to take the presidential office following the death of President Harrison. John Tyler, he's very much a part of these very mediocre presidents during this period. However, one notable thing that we can associate with his administration is he does, towards the end, push for and approve of the annexation of Texas. And what we'll ultimately see is he'll approve of this by the end of his presidential term. However, nonetheless, outside of that, his presidency is really unremarkable, and I think really he would be a good fit in the C category. So with that said, next we're moving on to James K. Polk, and he's actually an individual I want to stick a little bit of time on because I think while he's a part of this run of mediocre presidents, I ultimately think he should be talked about a lot more than he has been in history. Now, under Polk, we're ultimately going to see the Mexican-American War is going to be conducted. However, we're going to see the United States is going to make massive gains within its territory. We're going to see he's essentially going to double the size of the United States. We'll see that he'll realize the dream of all Americans that he would extend from coast to coast. And this was one thing that he had put forth on his platform in the election of 1844, was that he wanted to make sure that the U.S. would gain those territories like California, Arizona, New Mexico, that were at this time northern Mexico, as well as take control of the Oregon country. And what we ultimately see is that much of the platform he had established in 1844, he did accomplish. He did take control of all those regions. Upon being elected, he did announce that he would only serve one presidential term. He would become the youngest person to serve in the presidential office up to that point. But with all the accomplishments that he claimed during his administration, I think I would have to put him as a B. Now, there's going to be some very controversial legacies in regards to the acquisition of that land, but he does accomplish a great deal, especially in pushing the U.S. forward. Next up is Zachary Taylor. Now, Zachary Taylor will die in office, but he will spend a significant amount of time within the office before he dies, to where we can kind of put him within this presidential ranking. Really, most notably, Zachary Taylor is, despite being a Southern slaveholder, he's actually a Whig elected to the presidential office. He was also a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He was one of those hero generals that had emerged from the conflict. Despite being a Southern slaveholder, he's ultimately going to be opposed to the expansion of slavery, and he's going to tell the Southerners essentially that they need to accept this policy that slavery should not extend westward, that they should accept this as a norm and eventually lead to its death. However, once again, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to free all of his slaves right away. However, what we will see is that he's going to not support the Compromise of 1850 when this great crisis emerges to threaten to break up the United States. However, on July 4th, 1850, he's eventually going to drink cold milk after an extremely hot day, and he's going to develop a stomach ailment, and he'll be dead within the next day or so. And thus, he would die here in the middle of his presidential term. However, with that in mind, I think he's definitely a C president, because I think, one, there's not a lot that he does accomplish during his administration. However, I do think there's enough good to where he's trying to stop the expansion of slavery westward and trying to address that question of slavery and its future at this point in U.S. history. Following him, we'll see that his vice president, Millard Fillmore, will take the presidential office. He's going to be supportive of the Compromise of 1850, and we'll also see that he's going to help support and promote infrastructure projects within the United States. And so with that said, I think he's a solid C as well. The Compromise of 1850, I think, is a horrible compromise, because all it does is delay the Civil War. Because in reality, the Civil War could have broken out in 1850, and we see that it doesn't really quell any ill feelings between abolitionists and Southern secessionists. But nonetheless, it does delay the Civil War, and many historians say that it crucially does, because some make the argument that had the Civil War erupted in 1850, the North could have lost, but I'm not going to go into those arguments. But anyways, that with his infrastructure bills, I think, puts him as a good C president, another one of these mediocre presidents that doesn't really accomplish a whole lot during this period. All right, next is that of Franklin Pierce. Now, he's going to be our first F president, and here's why. Franklin Pierce, he was a rising political star by 1852 when he gets elected to become president of the United States. However, before he takes the presidential office, he will see some tragedy within his family. Notably, we'll see that his son is going to die and be decapitated on a train that's derailed as they're going to the White House to when Pierce would take his oath of office. And what we'll see is he'll essentially become a drunk throughout much of his administration and become very depressed as a result of this episode. However, with this, it's going to lead him to back many ill-advised decisions. We'll ultimately see that he's going to be the president that's going to oversee the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as well as the opening of the Bleeding Kansas episode. What we'll see throughout his administration is he's going to support the slaveholders within Kansas and support their I don't think the Lecompton Constitution came out quite during his administration, but he supports their government, which was essentially the minority population within the state. And we'll see he'll even threaten to use federal troops to break up, especially the abolitionists within the state. And so overall, he wasn't a very good and effective president. However, during his administration, something that's interesting, he does begin talks for building a potential transcontinental railroad. So that's something to think about in regards to his administration. However, following Pierce, he's not going to seek re-election. Largely, the Democrats see him as a failure, and they're going to nominate the brilliant but worst president in U.S. history, in my opinion, James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan's presidency is going to be very similar to Pierce's. He's not going to try to stop that developing crisis centering around the issue of slavery. We'll see that he'll be similar to Pierce, a dough-faced Northerner who supports Southern slaveholders, and especially with their idea of expanding slavery westward. We're going to see that he's going to oversee and support the Dred Scott decision, which essentially declared that African Americans had no legal rights within the United States and that they were unhuman, basically. We also see, as I mentioned, he's going to continue to support the Southerners in the Bleeding Kansas episode. However, more notably, what we're going to see is he'll be the president that's not going to stop the secession crisis. Now, to his credit, he did not cause the secession crisis. That was the outcome of the election of 1860. However, he does absolutely nothing to try to bring about compromise or at least try to quail the fears of the Southerners. We'll actually see that he'll not even provide federal aid to U.S. forces throughout many of the forts that they controlled throughout the South, especially Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. We'll see that he'll deny sending them supplies because he was very much afraid of the outbreak of hostilities during his administration. All right, with that said, the man that ultimately his election is going to cause the secession crisis is going to be that of Abraham Lincoln. And for me, he's going to go into the S category. This is largely because he's going to have a huge impact on the United States. We're going to see he's going to be the president that's going to lead the United States through not just the secession crisis, but ultimately the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. And he'll eventually be the president that looks to lead the nation out of that conflict. However, what we're going to see is that throughout his administration, besides dealing with obviously the many battles of the American Civil War, what we are going to see is that he's going to begin to address the issues surrounding the institution of slavery and try to address them once and for all. Originally, he tries to go around this idea that he doesn't want to abolish slavery, even though he saw it as a moral evil. However, by 1863, we see he pushes forth the Emancipation Proclamation, and likewise by 1865, he wants to make sure that that Emancipation Proclamation that promised to free the slaves within the Southern territories that were in rebellion would be extended to the U.S. Constitution, put into law, and in effect free all the slaves. And as you could probably guess, this has a huge impact on U.S. history, and this is largely why I put him in the S category. He ultimately frees the slaves and leads the United States to victory during the American Civil War. You can make an argument for the A category. However, I think overall the merits of his administration far outweigh any bad that you can make in regards to his administration. However, ultimately, he would not lead the United States through Reconstruction. What we're going to see is that days after Robert E. Lee surrenders, Lincoln's going to be shot and killed as a result, and therefore his vice president, that of Andrew Johnson, would become the president of the United States. This would also inaugurate another period of kind of mediocre presidents. However, what we'll ultimately see is that Johnson's administration is going to be extremely bad. Johnson was a Tennessean, a Democrat from, as I mentioned, from Tennessee. However, he becomes President Lincoln's vice presidential candidate because Lincoln, very much believing that his chances for success in the election of 1864 were very slim, nominates a Democrat to his party, or to the Republican ticket to try to boast up this idea of unionism, to get support from all Americans. However, ultimately, after his assassination, Johnson would carry out the remainder of Lincoln's second term. And what we're ultimately going to see is that Johnson is going to have a very lenient vision towards the South. He's not very interested on pushing forth such notions as equality or the rights of these recently freed slaves, and therefore he's going to allow for such things as black codes, race rights, to occur during his administration, which, as you could probably guess, are oppressing African Americans throughout the South. Congress is going to become involved, increasingly frustrated with Johnson's administration. What we'll ultimately see is he'll become the first president impeached. However, he will not be removed from office. The man that's ultimately going to succeed, that will follow Johnson, is going to be Ulysses S. Grant. The Republicans will reclaim the White House, despite the fact that they had won it during the previous presidential election. But Grant is one of these presidents that has all too often been ranked in, say, the D or the F categories in previous U.S. history. However, in the light of recent research, there's been more favorable light put on Grant because we could effectively recognize him as the first civil rights president in U.S. history. He backs the 15th Amendment when he begins to take the presidential office in 1869. He's going to continue to push for civil rights acts, most notably the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which argues against racial segregation. What we're also going to see is he's going to be very supportive of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, as well as further acts that look to eliminate white violence throughout the South. And therefore, he's very much going to try to push forth a Reconstruction that allows these recently freed slaves to have an equal standing within U.S. society, as well as really reconstruct the fabric of the nation, especially the social fabric. However, that's not to say that his administration was without flaws. We do see that he is very much so going to have corrupt members within his cabinet. This is what his administration has become most notably associated with. However, he himself did not participate in political corruption. It was just a matter of circumstance. He was very naive, and he appointed the wrong peoples within his administration. We'll also see that another black mark on his administration would be the Panic of 1873 also occurs during his administration, and he doesn't effectively respond to it as well. However, what we do see is that despite all this, he continues to try to push through Reconstruction. However, by 1874, with the panic and the corruption within his administration, Reconstruction was essentially dead in the water. Southern Democrats were regaining offices within all levels of the government. And therefore, Grant grew increasingly unpopular as a result. Another thing that was a black mark on his administration was the fact that he did approve of allowing U.S. settlers to enter the Sioux country in the Dakotas because there had been found in the region gold. However, early on in his administration, he did have very progressive ideas in regards to how Native Americans should be treated, and he promote this idea that the reason they see a lot of this violence along the frontier is because of bad whites, not because of Native Americans. But with all that considered, I think I would put him as a strong B candidate within this list. I do think corruption does strike him down from being an A in this case. Below him, or next, we have his successor is going to be Rutherford B. Hayes, and what we're going to see is that Hayes, when he's inaugurated to the presidential office, he's essentially going to come at a crucial time, especially in regards to Reconstruction. As I mentioned, the Democrats were on the rise, especially following the Panic of 1873. When we hit the election of 1876, it looked like the Democrats could retake office because people were just increasingly frustrated with the Republicans, and notably that of the Grant administration. However, a contested election emerges, and we ultimately see that Rutherford B. Hayes would become the next president of the United States after Congress strikes a deal essentially stating they would end Reconstruction and withdraw all federal troops from the South. This is going to lead him to be called his fraudulency during his administration. However, nonetheless, what we're going to see is that despite being surrounded by this idea of corruption, we're going to ultimately see that Hayes is going to try to stamp out corruption. We'll start to see that during his administration, he looks to try to push for civil service reform because he saw that the spoils system was largely for the reason we saw widespread corruption within Grant's administration. However, outside of this, we see he becomes a very pro-tariff candidate. As I mentioned, he abandons those policies of Reconstruction that the radical Republicans had pushed forward, this idea that African Americans should have equality. Rather, he's more in favor of economic politics, and specifically issuing tariffs that would be raised on foreign goods to promote American industry. So as we were seeing during this time, we also saw an industrial revolution engulf the United States. And so with all that considered, I think Hayes is a D candidate. I think largely because I'm just not a big fan of the tariffs that he pushed forth during this period. But I do see some goods, and I think I probably almost rank him as a D+. I think you could easily make him a C during this period as well. All right, and so next we have on our list is going to be that of James Garfield. Now, James Garfield, you could probably rank him. However, he's assassinated very early on in his term. If I'm not mistaken, he's shot about 4 months into his presidential term. He died 7 months into it. And so with that said, I'm going to put him as incomplete. but I think you could make an argument for him being ranked on this list. But for the sake of argument, I'll just go ahead and put him in complete. However, the man that's going to ultimately follow him is going to be that of Chester Arthur. Now, Chester Arthur, what's predominantly going to be associated with his administration is he's going to push for civil service reform. And this is interesting because he was a product of the spoil system, of the corruption of the Republican Party during this period. But he pushed for civil service reform because he was probably influenced by James Garfield, who likewise wanted to push forth this very issue, and especially with being assassinated by an individual who was seeking out a political appointment through this spoil system. Chester Arthur passes the Civil Service Act of 1883, thus beginning to establish that the U.S. government would not have individuals just appointed to these systems based because they know the right people, but rather they had to also take merit tests to prove that they were competent for these positions. And so with that in mind, he also does push forth the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as continue aggression towards Native Americans. However, I think with all these things considered, he's another one of these seed presidents. He doesn't really have a major impact, but I don't think you could make a very compelling argument for him being much worse than he actually is. Following him, we have a very reform-minded candidate, that of Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland largely promoted this idea of small laissez-faire government not being involved, especially within business affairs. However, nonetheless, what we do see is he does try to regulate the major industries during this period, especially with the Interstate Commerce Commission, to where he's essentially trying to strike down on unfair and unregulated railroad rates, because with the monopolization of many of these railroad companies, they dictated prices, and as a result, as you could probably guess, they're going to have very high prices on the market. So with that considered, he might be considered a high candidate. He also looked towards tariff reform. However, because of this, he's going to be unelected in 1888. However, he'll become the 24th president as well, and he'll continue this laissez-faire approach in his second non-consecutive term. However, we will see that he will put down the Pullman strike very harshly by becoming involved. I think with that considered, for me, it's a D, because I think with the laissez-faire type stance, he doesn't do a whole lot to improve American society, especially during the Gilded Age when we were seeing that these major industries needed to be regulated. So I'd put him as a D candidate, which is probably very controversial for some of these other presidential tier lists, which typically tend to rate him higher. Another easy D, I think, is going to be that of Benjamin Harrison. He doesn't accomplish a whole lot during his administration. Very pro-tariff. He'll actually support the McKinley tariff that comes out in 1890, which brings tariffs to these all-time highs. It's going to have a very negative impact on the U.S. economy. We're also going to see that he's going to support other Republican-led legislation that's not very popular. However, he does support the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, as well as the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Those are some other notable things that he had supported, but largely he's more of a puppet head for the Republican Party. He's not really a remarkable man, doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. I think because of that, it puts him as a D. Very much an imperialist, I will say. He does look to annex Hawaii, however, that comes a little bit later on. Next, which would be Grover Cleveland. We already talked about his second term, but following Grover Cleveland's second term, we're going to see the next president is going to be that of William McKinley. Now, William McKinley is a very staunch imperialist. However, I would make the argument during his administration, while he begins his term as one of these mediocre Gilded Age presidents that's more focused on tariffs, he does begin to establish more of what we would perceive as a modern presidential office. He does begin to expand federal authority, especially in regards to the president and his executive power a little bit, especially in the light of the Spanish-American War. He leads the United States through that war, and he's going to expand the U.S. territory overseas. He's going to gain Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, all this during his administration. However, we will see there's a major black mark on his administration, which would be the Philippine-American War, which if you read into it, there's a lot of atrocities committed by U.S. troops. However, you can't really give all the fault to McKinley because he was thousands of miles away from the Philippines and didn't probably truly understand the situation. But nonetheless, you have to mark that against his presidency. However, with all things considered, I will say there's a little bit of bias towards McKinley for me. I don't know why. He's just a fascinating figure in history for me, but I'm going to have to rank him as a C. And I could even make the argument, you know what, I'm going to even do that. I'm going to go to B because he does begin to establish the United States as a world power. And we also start to see that he begins to transition the United States into the new century. And he also begins to slowly expand the power of the executive branch. However, something that would be truly accelerated under his successor, that of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, I'm going to easily put him as an A. He has a lot of good within his administration. He pushes forth a lot of progressive reforms. He tries to pursue the Sherman Antitrust Act to where he's going to begin to break up these trusts that were forming these monopolies within these major industries. We also see that he leads the conservationist movement, this movement that helps establish later on the National Park Service, but really tries to preserve land from many of these major industries destroying, because especially within the Northwest, we saw like industries like the lumber and oil industry had ravaged the environment, so he begins to regulate them as well. He's an overall badass. Just read into his story about his entire life. He's just a fascinating figure. However, what would make him not an S is probably his ego. Now, this occurs a little bit after his administration, but you do see it develop within his as well. And also, imperialism is a big role within his administration, too. He becomes heavily involved with Latin American countries, and he doesn't exactly allow them to practice their own sovereignty. He wants the U.S. involved heavily. But nonetheless, I think the good heavily outweigh the bad in regards to Roosevelt. His successor continues many of his progressive policies in regards to the Antitrust Act that I had mentioned. Be William Howard Taft. He's going to be a huge trust buster. He's going to break up Standard Oil and American tobacco during this period. However, he's going to abandon the conservationist movement, and this is going to lead him to have a fallout with Theodore Roosevelt, and we'll ultimately see how this is going to affect the next presidential election. We see that he's more economically conservative from Roosevelt. However, nonetheless, I think Taft, given what he was able to accomplish, would be a C, and probably he could even make the case for a C plus, at least for me. But nonetheless, what we're going to ultimately see is that his feud with Theodore Roosevelt that had developed in the latter days of his administration would have a huge impact on U.S. history, especially because Roosevelt, who was not limited by any constitutional amendment to run for a third term, is going to decide to do this. However, Taft will become the Republican nominee, but Roosevelt, not stopping there, who's very much frustrated with Taft and his administration, is going to run as a third party. Effectively, what we're going to see is that by doing this, by establishing the Progressive or the Bull Moose Party, Roosevelt would split the Republican vote, and it would allow Woodrow Wilson, who only won 42% of the popular vote, to easily cruise into almost a landslide election. Now, Woodrow Wilson himself, he's a very controversial figure. The guy, personally, I do not like. Okay, he's an extremely racist individual. He promoted segregation within the federal government. We also see that he watches The Birth of the Nation, which, go look it up, but it's an extremely racist film that glorifies the KKK during Reconstruction. He films it, or he shows it within the presidential, or within the White House. He essentially stated that it was sad that this history in his eyes was so true because it was like writing history with lightning. But nonetheless, he does push for some progressive reforms, although they were a little more conservative, because he does argue that the people should, while they should want government intervention, they should also fear that the government itself could become corrupt. He does push forth such things as the Clayton Antitrust Act, which kind of further expands the Sherman Antitrust Act, as well as ending child labor within his administration. We do see, if I'm not mistaken, it's during his administration that suffrage is pushed forth. However, if I'm not mistaken, he was against women's suffrage during this point. But with all things considered, I just can't vote him high for me. I think he's an easy F for me. Although his leadership during World War I you could view as, well, actually, let's get back into that. That actually makes him more of an F now that I think of it. His leadership in World War I wasn't entirely effective. What we see, he does push forward the 14 points, which were something that was very much a positive on Wilson, to where he wants to try to establish a peace with Germany that favored them, or I shouldn't say favored, but that put them in a better light than what the Treaty of Versailles had accomplished, as well as building a League of Nations. So it was on the right tracks. But ultimately, his leadership during the First World War is very much up in question, because what we do see is that while he's promoting this idea, he wants to make the world safe for democracy, he's ultimately going to limit the rights of Americans back home. What we'll see is he'll pass the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which essentially is going to be similar to what we had seen during the Adams administration, where he's going to limit Americans' First Amendment rights. And so with that said, a easily F with that, now that I consider that. Another F would be Warren Harding. With Harding, I wouldn't rank him extremely low on the F list, though. One thing he was very much a proponent of was civil rights. Actually, in a speech that he gave in Birmingham, Alabama, he did promote that Southerners should accept equal rights and allow African Americans to actively participate within the economic as well as political systems. Obviously, this is extremely unpopular at the time in the South, which was enthralled with Jim Crow. However, his administration's enthralled in scandal, and he eventually meets his own tragic end with all the scandal, because what we'll ultimately see is that he's going to die of, if I'm not mistaken, a heart attack during his or in 1923, which then leads rise to the next president, which is going to be that of Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge is going to be a very conservative Republican during this period. What we're going to see is he promotes a more laissez-faire type government. Let the people do as they please. And therefore, he's going to call for lower taxes, lower tariffs on the American people. However, this is not to say that he believes that the federal government should have no authority. He does push through some policies that, I don't want to say expand the federal government, but that do try to regulate American society during this period. With that considered, I almost want to, I'll go ahead and put him in the A. He was very much a politician that understood that there should be limits to the president in the executive branch. And there wasn't really a lot of bad in his presidency. We even see when he wins his election in his own right in 1924 that shortly after he doesn't want to run for another term in the near future. Very much an individual I think a lot of people could ultimately back. However, with that said, his successor is not going to be extremely popular. What we're going to see is that Herbert Hoover would be another Republican that would be elected to the presidency, would be elected in 1928. Now, he doesn't cause the Great Depression. However, the Great Depression begins during his administration, and you can't blame him for the Great Depression, because we did see during 1927 and 1928, the U.S. economy was slowly going downhill, not to mention the overproduction that was rampant amongst farmers within the post-war years. However, he doesn't do a lot to help get the U.S. out of the Depression. We'll actually see he'll even make it worse by dumping money onto the U.S. economy, something that very much drove it even worse into the Depression. We also see during his administration that he likewise puts down the bonus army that marches on the Capitol. The bonus army was World War I veterans who, through an act that had been passed in 1924, were promised bonuses by the U.S. government for their service during the First World War. And so they look to gain these bonuses in the midst of the Depression. However, Hoover is going to call on the U.S. Army to strike them down. As you could probably guess, this is not going to make him widely popular. And regardless of who would have ran against him in 1932, they would have won. Ultimately, the person that's going to win is going to be that of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, one thing about him is his presidency is going to be the longest presidency in U.S. history. He's ultimately going to be elected to 4 terms. However, there's really 2 areas that you can divide it up into. His first 2 terms during the Great Depression and the New Deal era periods, and then also his latter 2 terms during World War II. His New Deal terms, they expand the authority of the national government. However, they were the right call at the time, I believe. While they're not highly successful and they don't bring the U.S. out of the Depression, it did bring hope to the American people. So I think overall they were good. However, they were ineffective in the long run. We also see, though, that his leadership during World War II was especially exceptional, and ultimately he's going to be beloved by the American people as a result of his leadership during World War II. And so with that considered, I think I'd put him in the A category. I think that's just fitting for him. Very much so. I think he was a good leader. There are bad qualities, and I'd probably put him as an A-. I'm teetering on between the A and the B categories, because We do see he wants to pack the Supreme Court to try to get his policies put forth. We do see when he pushes through the second New Deal during his second presidential term, it's much more radical and tries to expand the federal government much, much more. But once again, I think the good ultimately outweigh the bad. As I mentioned, he's going to serve the longest presidency in the office. We'll ultimately see his successor would come in 1945 when he dies in the presidential office, and it'd be that of Harry Truman. And for me, Truman's going to be an A. And this is largely because of his leadership in the early years of the Cold War. I think he was very effective, especially establishing the U.S.'s position against the Soviet Union. It's not to say that his presidency was without negatives. Towards the end of his administration, we do start, or I shouldn't say towards the end, it's actually at the beginning, shortly after the Second World War, we do see that a small depression emerges. However, this is largely because if you know anything about the logistical scene surrounding a war, when you come out of a war, odds are you're going to enter a small depression. But nonetheless, I think his leadership alone against the Soviet Union in these formative years very early on gives him an A. Likewise, I think also strong leadership during this period would be demonstrated by Dwight Eisenhower. He was very much not an advocate for the federal government to be involved with Americans' affairs. We do see under his administration, because of this, the American society would begin to prosper. However, what we also see during his administration that was positive, he does begin to trend in the right directions in regards to civil rights, because we see he's going to back the Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, which strikes down the notion of separate but equal and calls for an end of racial segregation within schools. We're going to see likewise he's going to help support the African-American students, if I'm not mistaken, 8 of them who are going to attend Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he's going to send in the 101st Airborne to make sure that they are not essentially seeing their rights threatened by the white mobs that were forming and protests around them. However, there are some negative aspects to his administration, most notably the U2 summit, where he's kind of embarrassed on the national stage. We also see that he does help formulate the plans for the Bay of Pigs, which would go into action during the Kennedy administration, so that's not a strong mark. However, by the end of his administration, we do see that he helps lead the United States into the space race, helps establish NASA, right, and helps the U.S. Once again challenge Russia, or I shouldn't say Russia, the Soviet Union on the world stage. Following that, it's going to be that of John F. Kennedy. For me, he's going to be a B. This is largely because of his leadership through the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was exceptional. I think it's probably one of the best displays of presidential leadership in U.S. history. However, the rest of his administration wasn't very particularly good. It starts off with the Bay of Pigs episode, which ends in utter failure. We ultimately see that while he does help cut taxes, a lot of his other legislation wasn't particularly strong. However, we do start to see that he helps continue to push forth the civil rights movement as well. However, one being until his successor, that of LBJ, who will be the last president I'll talk about on this list, who would eventually push forth civil rights. LBJ, with him, he's going to ascend to the presidency following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And we're ultimately going to see is that LBJ would become the president that would effectively enact civil rights. He put forth the Civil Rights Act of 1864, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, effectively ensuring that African Americans could not be discriminated against and allow them equal opportunities, especially within the political process. However, with that said, there's a lot of dark marks also on his administration. Well, actually, let me finish up on the positive. We do see he establishes Medicare and Medicaid. You could make arguments that they're bad organizations. However, I think they were done with good intentions. However, as I mentioned, there's dark marks on his presidency, and most notably that of the Vietnam War debacle. Especially in the light of the Pentagon Papers, we see that he directly leads to the escalation of events in Vietnam, a war that we probably should not have been involved with. And so with all that considered, I think C, there was a huge good and a huge bad, so I think that would be fair for him to say. Now, I'm not going to go into Nixon all the way up to Trump on this list. Partially, one, because the Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan administrations, I don't know a whole lot about, as I do the rest of these presidents. but especially with Reagan moving onwards, they're more contemporary, and I think a lot of your political beliefs kind of dilute the impact that some of these individuals have on history. So that's why I've chosen to exclude them. This is my presidential tier list as it stands. Hopefully, you find some knowledge from going through this journey with me. Hopefully, there was some good you took away with it. Maybe you have some counter arguments to some of the decisions I've ultimately made. Leave that in the comments below. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely enjoyed making it. And hopefully, in the future, I'll be able to do more videos like this to where I could have little topics in U.S. history that we could talk about and kind of elaborate on a little bit in the future. But in the meantime, enjoy. Hopefully, we'll get some good feedback from this video. But other than that, I'll see you guys later.